This is a 2002 Chevy Corvette Z06, and it's just about the best performance car bargain in existence. It's the high-performance version of the regular Corvette from this era, except it does 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. It runs the quarter mile in the 12s. It's rear-wheel drive, it only came with a 6-speed manual, and it's surprisingly light. And these days, you can pick one of these up for around $20,000. And today, I'm going to explain why you should. This video comes to us courtesy of Stick Shift Studios, which is a YouTube channel run by the owner of the car. You can check it out by clicking the link in the description below this video. Now, I'm going to start with a little history. The Corvette first came out in the 1950s, and occasionally throughout its history, there were various high-performance versions that offered a little more sportiness and a little extra power than the standard models. The 5th generation Corvette, the C5, came out in 1997, and it was a huge deal when it came out. It was the first new Corvette in 15 years. But it got better. In 2001, Chevy came out with a high-performance version of their Corvette called the Z06. Now, while the regular Corvette had around 350 horsepower, the Z06 had 385 horsepower, which was bumped to 405 horses for the 2002 model year like this car. The Z06 also had better suspension and had bigger wheels and tires, and it weighed about 40 pounds less than the regular Corvette as well. And while you could get the standard Corvette as a convertible or a hatchback, or for a couple of rare model years as a coupe, the Z06 was only offered as a true fixed roof coupe. It was the most rigid and stiffest body style. The Z06 was also only offered with a 6-speed manual transmission. The C5 Z06 has been cool ever since it came out nearly 20 years ago now, but it's especially cool these days because it's gotten so cheap. This is an amazing rear-wheel drive, manual transmission, 2-seat V8 sports car, and you can get one for $30,000 for the absolute nicest one, $25,000 for a pretty decent one, and $20,000 for an average car with some higher miles. Right now, on AutoTrader, there are 120 C5 Z06s listed for sale for $25,000 or less. And that's a bargain because this car is just so great. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of the C5 Z06, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of one of today's best performance car bargains. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the C5 Z06, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the best used American car high-performance bargains currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the C5 Z06 by discussing probably the most obvious feature on this car that some people don't like, and that would be the interior, and specifically the interior quality. The C5 Corvette came out of the 1990s, out of General Motors in the 1990s, and so the interior just really isn't all that nice. It looks like a 1990s General Motors vehicle with a lot of cheap plastic all over the place, and many of the buttons and switches and dials are just ugly and cheap looking. You can see the radio is used in basically every other GM vehicle with these ugly rounded buttons. It doesn't look like the kind of interior that you would want in a performance car. And there's some specifically bad pieces, the biggest of which is probably the panel gaps. You can see the panel gap here around the center control stack is just way too large. Even panel gaps for little foldable compartments in the middle and the center console are just way too big, way too pronounced. But probably the worst one is over here separating the dashboard from the door panel. You can stick fingers inside this panel gap. It is just way, way too large. Another thing I don't like about this interior, the door handles are absolutely not befitting like an expensive special performance car. It looks like a cheap, budget, low-grade interior. And probably the biggest reason that some people don't buy these cars is because of this interior quality. But if you can get past that, there's a lot to like, and there are many more quirks and features. For example, I want to start by directing your attention to the center console. console where there is a button marked Active Handling. You can use this button to turn on and off traction control and the active handling mode, which helps keep you in control of the car. It's sort of like a stability control system. Now, my favorite thing about active handling is the button to turn it on and off has a picture of a car sliding, not just any car, but a Corvette, and not just any Corvette, but a C5 Corvette, and actually a pretty good image of a C5 Corvette on that button. It is a nice little piece of attention to detail. Now, one interesting thing about that active handling button, there's sort of a secret mode that goes along with it. If you press it, you can turn active handling and traction control on or off, and you can see it change in the gauge cluster. But if you hold down the button, eventually it will go into competitive driving mode. This turns traction control off, but it keeps some component of the active handling system still on. I guess this is the mode you want to be in if you're actually driving the car on a racetrack in competitive driving. Now, next up, moving on in the center console, there's a little compartment next to the shift lever. You open that up and you have the world's smallest cup holder. This is probably only large enough for a can of soda, if even that, and it has no depth at all to it. So even if you put something in there, it will spill out the moment you go around a corner at Corvette speeds. As a result, the owner of this car installed this little cup holder in the passenger side footwell. He tells me a lot of Corvette owners do this because the factory cup holder, and that is the only one, is not particularly useful. Now, next we move on to the climate control, and there's a feature in this vehicle that I have never seen before. Now, this car has automatic climate control. You can see there's an auto button, and it has different temperatures for the driver and the passenger. Not all that uncommon. Most cars have that. The weird part is only the driver side is automatic. The driver can adjust their temperature to whatever is desired and press auto, and then the vents and the temperature sensors in the car will make sure it happens. But the passenger doesn't get any temperature sensors or any actual temperature on the screen. The passenger just twists their dial, and that sends cold or hot air out of the vents. The passenger has no auto climate control. So this is dual zone climate control with auto for the driver and manual climate control for the passenger side. Now, if the passenger side climate dial is in the center position here, the one with the little white mark on the top, then the passenger side is equivalent to whatever is on the driver side. It only changes when you start to adjust the passenger climate dial. Now, next, I want to move on to the dashboard, and specifically I want to talk about the grab handle. Now, for years, Corvettes had grab handles, I guess, in case you were taking on some fast curves and you needed something to hold on to, but the placement is so bizarre. They stick it up here, and you're supposed to grab on like this as if you're on a roller coaster. Like, slow down, that's too fast. They have kept the grab handle in the newer Corvettes, but they've moved it into the center console, which probably makes more sense. You can grab on like this. It seems like such a strange spot to have it up here, but this is like a throwback to all the older Corvettes which had it, and they kept it through this car as well. Now, below the grab handle, you have the airbag cover, which says Corvette on it. To me, this is kind of the low point of the entire interior. Most cars integrate their airbag cover into the dashboard, so you never even know it's there. In this car, you can see the materials are different. They don't line up. It just doesn't really look all that good over on the passenger side. Now, next we move on to the center console, which is unusual in a couple of ways. First off, it's only hinged towards the driver. The passenger doesn't get any access to it. Only the driver does. And the other odd thing is the hinge itself. When you open it, it doesn't just fly open. Instead, you open it and the hinge kind of pushes it up and open, I think so that it clears the parking brake. And the result is that it keeps the passenger out of the center console even more because it actually moves the console lid up to block the passenger's access. Now, that actually may be intentional because over on the passenger side, you have a glove box, and that glove box has a lock on it so you can put stuff in. And for the driver, there's the center console, which also has a lock, so you can lock it after you've put stuff in it. So there are basically two different lockable compartments in here, maybe one for the driver and one for the passenger. Although I wouldn't like to be the passenger trying to fit stuff into the glove box because it's incredibly small. You can see it basically only has enough room for the owner's manual, and that's about it. So it's no surprise why they wanted to add the center console with more lockable interior storage. Next up, another interesting item in this interior. This car, if you look around, it doesn't have an interior dome light. There's no dome light mounted anywhere on the ceiling. That's because when you open the doors, the interior lighting is provided by tiny little lights under the mirror, which also serve as the map lights. Now, if you look at those lights, you'll notice that they light up in like a blue and an amber. It's kind of an odd thing. It's not just a traditional off-white light like you see in so many cars. And the owner tells me when you drive this at night, those blue and amber lights shine down on the shift lever and they light up your gear pattern in case you know, you forget where first is and all the other gears. Next up, another interesting item with this car. There are 4 climate vents in this interior, 2 for the passenger side, and then there are 2 for the driver's side, 1 in the middle, and the other one is mounted on the door, which is unusual. Some cars do have that, but it is rare. So as a result, there's actually a duct that goes through the dashboard and into the door, so it can deliver air to that climate vent and blow air on the driver, and you have your heat or your air conditioning on. Now, speaking of interesting items on the door, I want to bring your attention to the switch panel over on the driver's side of the door. You have a bunch of different switches over here, and they're not plastic switches like in almost every other car. Instead, they're rubber. It's going to be hard for me to show this on camera, but these are like little rubber switches, and you push them, and that's how you roll down the window. It's how you lock the doors. It's changed the memory settings for the seats, and it's even how you change the mirrors. It's kind of strange. There's no little switch to move it from left to right mirror. Instead, you press these little rubber buttons, LT and RT, and then you can move the mirror around with this little rubber pad. It's a very unusual set of controls for these things, and the owner tells me that on cars that have been driven a lot, that have high miles, people press them a lot, their oils and their fingers get onto them, and then holes actually start poking through those rubber buttons over time, but these are in excellent rubberized shape. Now, next up, moving over to the left of the steering wheel, another interesting button in this car is the trunk opener button, and I say that because it's in this large plastic housing, but then the button itself is rather small. This is another questionable interior detail in this car. Why do you need plastic on top of plastic on top of plastic with extra plastic housings for a button? The answer is you don't. It doesn't look all that good. It just looks strange. But above that, we have an excellent feature of this car, and that would be the controls for the heads-up display. Now, these days, heads-up displays are becoming pretty common in luxury and performance cars, but back when this car came out, nobody had it. In fact, this car was one of the first, and you can see the display projected on the screen in front of you. This is very useful, and it's a desirable feature even now, and it was in its infancy when this car came out. Now, like I mentioned, you can control the heads-up display with these little buttons to the left of the gauge cluster. The one that's marked off with the little dial changes the brightness. You can raise or lower the dial, which will raise or lower the brightness of the heads-up display. Now, below that, you have display with arrows that raises or lowers the position of the heads-up display. And at the top, you have page, and you can cycle through a few different items. You have your oil, your engine temperature, and it'll show your current fuel level, which is all useful info projected right in front of you. So this is one of the earliest heads-up displays. Now, next up, moving over to the other side of the gauge cluster, there are some interesting buttons over there. You can see they're labeled 1 through 5, and they have some words on them. And as you press them, you can cycle through various different things in this info screen below the speedometer and the tachometer. For example, press fuel, and you can look at your average fuel economy or your instant fuel economy. Gauges will show your oil pressure, your battery voltage, that sort of thing. Trip will show your trip odometer, your oil life, your average speed. And then number 4 is options, and that'll allow you to configure a few different options, like whether the vehicle honks its horn and flashes its lights when you press the lock button while you're walking away. I'm not exactly sure why those buttons are numbered, why they don't just say fuel gauges, trip, options. They actually have distinct numbers, but for some reason they are. Now, the 5th button on the bottom, that switches between miles per hour and kilometers per hour, and it's kind of interesting because the speedometer switches instantaneously. So if you're driving along at 60 miles per hour and you press that button, the speedometer will instantly jump to 100 kilometers per hour. It's very strange. The speedo can make that change with the press of a simple button rather than having to go into some screen and configure something or having to read a kilometers display in smaller font on the speedometer. Now, finally, in the interior, like I mentioned, the glove box in this car is insanely small, but it does contain the owner's manual, which, it's worth noting, comes in its own little Z06 owner's manual pouch. Now, when you open up that pouch, you're also greeted with a Z06 pen and a Z06 tire gauge. That's kind of cool. My tire gauge doesn't have a Z06 logo on it. But anyway, you open it up, and you open up the owner's manual, you'll find a couple of interesting quirks in here. For example, I want to start on page 6-8. There's a warning that says, if you get gasoline on yourself and something ignites it, you could be badly burned. Thanks for that. That is a helpful warning, and I'm glad my owner's manual tells it to me. Wouldn't have known otherwise. Now, the other interesting things in the owner's manual to me are the hand-drawn depictions of the car. For example, I really like on page 4-30, it talks about driving your car in the snow and getting stuck, and you can see, look at this poor C5 stuck in the snow with this cartoonish drawing. I love this. It looks so cool. But that's not my favorite drawing in the owner's manual. And you turn a few pages earlier, and you can see someone has drawn this beautiful mountain mountain road, mountains in the background, and deer off to the side. What a wonderful scene. This person should be an artist. Imagine going to art school and, oh, what are you doing these days? Oh, I'm drawing stuff for General Motors owner's manuals. Oh, interesting. Huh. Now, next up, I want to move on to the outside of the Z06. I want to start with the pop-up headlights. Now, obviously, most people know these, but if you don't, the headlights are concealed until you turn them on, at which point they pop up and illuminate, and then when you turn them back off, they pop back down into their home, and that kind of gives the car a cleaner look in the front. Now, pop-up headlights were pretty common in the 80s and into the 90s, and the C5 Corvette came out in 97 when they were just falling out of favor, but Chevy decided to include them anyway. Now, this generation of Corvette was built all the way through 2004, and by then pop-ups were definitely no longer in style, and so this car was the last vehicle to have pop-up headlights. Sort of. The Lotus Esprit also had pop-up headlights, and it was also built through 2004 and canceled that same year, and pop-up headlights went away on those two vehicles. Now, next up, moving around to the back of the car, two interesting items worth noting. One is probably the Z06's most distinctive exterior feature, and that is this little vent in front of the rear wheels. This is actually a duct for brake cooling. It brings in air, and then it sort of routes it around into the wheel well, and you can see it if you look back there. It's not going to be able to show up on camera, but it sends air to the brakes to cool them down if you're on the track. The regular Corvettes didn't have this little vent on the side. The Z06s do, and it's an easy way to tell them apart. Now, another distinctive feature of the C5 Z06 is the fact that it was a true coupe. Now, the C5 Corvette was offered in 3 body styles. There was the convertible. You couldn't get a C5 Z06 convertible. And then there was a hatchback version with a liftable back window, and you couldn't get that as a Z06 either. The only way the Z06 came was as a fixed coupe with a trunk rather than a liftable back window. Now, Chevy did make a small number of regular C5 Corvette coupes that aren't Z06s, but they're very uncommon. The vast majority of coupe C5 models are Z06s. And so let's talk about the trunk. Now, to open it, you press a little button on the key fob. It pops open to here, and then you can lift it open. And you can see this is an actual liftable body panel rather than like a glass hatchback piece like most of the other non-convertible C5 Corvettes. But anyway, you have it open, and there are a couple of interesting things about it. The most interesting is the fact that this trunk isn't separated from the passenger compartment. I never really knew this. I always figured because it was a coupe, there was a separation between the seats and the trunk area, but there isn't. It's all one big fluid area, and the owner tells me this is a big benefit because you can stick larger items in here and use your Z06 to transport a television, for example, if that's what you decide to do. Now, next up, another interesting item in the trunk. If you look in here, you'll notice it isn't a flat floor in here. Instead, there are some cutouts in the trunk that seem to be randomly placed. If you're wondering why that is, well, the owner told me that on the regular C5 model, there's like a little plastic storage cubby in this spot. And so you can open it up and stick stuff in here, and then it can't be seen when you look into the trunk, and it won't fly around the interior compartment, which makes sense. But for the Z06, they were trying to save as much weight as possible, and so they removed that plastic storage compartment and probably saved 9 ounces in the process, and so you have this weird load floor with random cutouts in it. And since I'm back here, a couple of other interesting items worth pointing out. I want to start with the antenna. Now, the regular C5 Corvette had one of those power antennas that would go up when you turned on the radio. The Z06 ditched that to save weight. Instead, it has this fixed antenna that doesn't go up anywhere near as far. The owner told me it doesn't get as good reception, but such are the sacrifices in order to save probably like 9 ounces of weight. Now, another interesting item back here, you can see the Corvette badge along the back and the Corvette badge on the trunk. Something I didn't realize is behind the license plate, there's also a Chevy logo. No one will ever see that, but it's there just in case you take off your license plate and then you're like, yay, I have a Chevy. One other interesting badging item on this car, on the front fenders, you have the Z06 badge to show off that this is a Z06. Now, in 2001, the Z06 had only 385 horsepower. It was increased to 405 horsepower for 2002. And when they made that change, they added a little notation to the badge indicating that this was the 405 horsepower model and not that crappy first-year Z06. I bet first-year Z06 owners felt pretty bad when this one came out with 20 more horsepower and with that cool badge that showed them up. And finally, we move under the hood where you can take a look at the engine. This is the LS6 V8. Like I mentioned, 405 horsepower. Nothing weird or quirky with it, but it is a very beautiful thing to see mounted in the front of this car. Nice old naturally aspirated V8. Now, one other interesting mechanical item with this car is the fact that Chevy went with a titanium exhaust to save weight. That is a pricey and frankly rather substantial decision just for some weight savings, and it only actually saved 18 pounds over the regular C5 Corvette stainless steel exhaust, but Chevy decided to do it to get a little weight savings where possible. It's not common even today, 20 years after this car went on sale. And so those are the quirks and features of the C5 Corvette Z06. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive it. All right, driving the C5 Z06. You know, I recently drove one of the newer Z06s, and it definitely feels more refined and more, not luxurious, but you know, the tech is nicer, the interior is nicer, better than this car. But the rawness, I think, is one of the cool things about this car, and that's one of the reasons it's so cheap. This isn't a refined luxury car with all the fixins. This is just a fun kind of car you can throw around, and it's about performance above all else. And that's the primary reason why I like it. The ride is definitely rough. That was a big complaint back in the day. Power delivery is strong. The car feels real quick. It always, I mean, 0 to 60 in 4 seconds still feels fast. The car has just so much torque. The thing about it is you don't need to put that much throttle in to get a lot of torque out of it. It feels like a fast car. It really, boy, the ride is so rough. Going over any bump or anything like that, whew. But it feels like a fast car. It really, really does. This doesn't feel fast for 2001 when it first came out. You know, 20 years ago it's been almost. It doesn't feel fast for then. It still feels fast. Part of the sensation though is you're low, it's kind of rough, it's loud, and so this car gives you a great sensation of speed. You're not removed from it or anything like you are in some German cars. The gear lever does definitely feel notchy. The clutch is fine. It took a little getting used to, a minute or two, but I think it's fine. No complaints. It isn't quite as buttery smooth. Neither the clutch nor the shifter are like as buttery smooth as a Porsche. In terms of interior space, I got a lot. It's really not that big of a deal. I'm a little close to the gauges and the steering wheel and all that, but you know, not enough that it matters, and I still have a couple of inches of headroom. Wow, steering is actually pretty good. There's a little bit of vagueness on center, common of cars from this era, I think, but it's pretty strong. The handling especially is good. Very little body roll, goes exactly where you put it. Yeah, the steering is good, and another cool thing about it is it's weighted well. It feels like it has a lot of weight to it as opposed to so many modern cars that feel light. They feel precise, but still it's just too easy to turn it and all that. This feels like an old school sports car. It's nice steering weight. And the car really does change directions quickly and predictably, in a good way. The thing is, I totally get the complaint. It isn't that nice in here, right? Like there are big panel gaps, there's circles and all that. It doesn't look that good. But, you know, when you're driving hard, you're not looking at the interior. And so that's the C5 Chevy Corvette Z06. I've always wanted to review this car because frankly, I've always really liked it. I had a Cadillac CTS V with the same powertrain as this car, and it was great as a performance sedan. But it's even better as a performance coupe, as this car proves, and it's even better when you can get it for like 20 grand. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the C5 Z06 looks okay, though the C5 in general hasn't aged tremendously well. It gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, so it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is fantastic, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is also high. This car is tremendously enjoyable to drive and drive fast, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and these haven't gotten especially cool yet. They're surprisingly common for now, but it'll still turn a few heads, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 33 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features, and you don't get much in a C5 Z06. It gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is not high. There's a decent amount of interior room, but the ride is rough, and you get a 3 out of 10. Quality is a mix. The interior is terrible, frankly, but reliability is excellent. It splits the difference with a 6 out of 10. Practicality is mediocre with small cargo space and only 2 seats, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Finally, value, and this is where this car shines. It's one of the best bargains in the car world right now, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total daily score of 24 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 57 out of 100, which places it here among some other similar cars. The C5 Z06 Z06 ties the S2000 and comes right behind the Porsche 996 C4S, which is excellent company for the Z06 to be in. All three are very different cars, but all three offer lots of thrills for the money, and I love them all. It just depends on how you want to get there.